Hi there. My name's Jen Goldsack, and I'm the Executive Director of the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. Um, this was a tough one to put together. I am honored to kick off the summit, and I'm certainly not an expert in diabetes, and so it was challenging for me to think how I could bring value to such a terrific group of experts gathered together here. Now, what I am an expert in is digital technologies and how they can be used to advance the safe, effective, ethical, and equitable sort of practice of medicine and research. And so that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And, digital health, why do we care? If I wanted to be really provocative, I could talk about the amount of money that's being invested into the field. I could talk about the media that now, this was a lovely report from Stat News just a couple of weeks ago, reporting that healthcare is undergoing a monumental shift toward remote patient monitoring. We could talk about, in recent months, 3 of the 5 biggest companies in the world have gone in on this idea of remote monitoring. Amazon came out with their Halo. Google is well on its way to acquiring Fitbit, and the Fitbit Sense on September 11th was not only cleared by the FDA, but also received its CE mark in Europe. And then for anyone who caught the virtual launch of the recent sort of Apple products, the Apple Watch 6 was absolutely front and center of that. And quite frankly, all they spoke about all day was healthcare applications of their technology. So, is this why we really care about technology? There's a ton of money in it. There's a ton of hype. Is that what matters? I'm going to say certainly not. I'm going to pause for a second and let's together take stock of where we are. We spend more money on healthcare than any other country per capita. I know it's well over $3 trillion. It's bigger than the GDP of France. But now households in the United States, kitchen table conversations, we are responsible as families for over $1 trillion out of pocket. Despite spending all this money, not only do we have a decreasing life expectancy, we are also dying. Our workforce has a higher death rate than any other developed country in the world. We have catastrophic diseases that have a terrible impact on individuals' lives and their families, and we have absolutely no disease-modifying treatments for them. The main reason that most Americans file for bankruptcy is because of healthcare debt and healthcare bills. And I heard recently that this is also the number 2 reason now cited for divorces in the United States. All comes back to healthcare costs. And while we're on the topic, just even when we do have tremendous ways of managing a condition, and you guys know this far better than me, 1 in 4 individuals in the US still rations their insulin because they cannot afford to treat their condition in the way in which they have established with their clinician. We see war fighters coming home and we're unable to wrap our arms around them, keep them safe. And we're seeing suicide rates due to PTSD in our war fighters at unprecedented levels. This isn't patients only. We're seeing physicians really struggling. We see a higher suicide rate in clinical practitioners than we do, again, any other sort of discipline within the professional workforce. It's a very, very gloomy picture. And while I'm certainly not suggesting that technology is the silver bullet that can solve all of these problems, I am optimistic that if we develop these tools, if we are thoughtful and intentional around how we develop and deploy digital technologies in the service of health, we can move the needle in these pressing and persistent challenges. And what I wanted to run through just for a couple of minutes is what's different? What's different now? What is it about digital today that we couldn't have done 10 years ago? Why are these pressing problems here on the screen potentially ready to be addressed by a new digital toolbox? We're seeing new digital capabilities, even compared to 10 years ago. Our capacity to do supercomputing and to analyze huge amounts of data that are increasingly available digitally is an emerging capability. We can see the expectations of patients and individuals are quite different to how they have been previously. I'm sure many of you have a gadget or a smartphone on your desk as you're sitting in and tuning in today. A lot of people have expectations. They have high hopes for digital technologies. They are familiar with them during their everyday lives. And we can see that, they now expect the products and services that they consume to be a better experience because of digital. we should apply that to healthcare. We all expect hyper-personalization, not just in, what Netflix is suggested to us, but in terms of what we need based on our sort of archetype as a patient. And a really interesting move away from ownership to access that I think is an important conversation. We can discuss it in the Q&A around, how do we consider digital data sets when they're not manila folders that live in a locked file cabinet, but multiple people with authorization could potentially have access to them. We're seeing a lot of government initiatives. The Cures Act is now final. That is an interoperability rule that is intended to promote innovation. It's also intended to promote patient access to their own health information. FDA launched about this time last year their Technology Modernization Action Plan, and they had a huge public meeting about advancing those goals and their own technology modernization this summer. There's also a federal health IT plan. This was launched for public comment in the spring, and they're taking those public comments back and implementing them. But this was a very aggressive and thoughtful, I thought, 5-year plan that really had sort of patients right at the center of it, supported by a new sort of wave of technological approaches. It was really encouraging to see this. So, we've thought about the pressing challenges that we are encountering. And frankly, I don't want this to become a talk around COVID, but COVID has really shone a light on things like health disparities, around the challenges to quickly and affordably develop therapies that is sort of exemplar of the larger challenges we face. But we also shouldn't be fooled. I'm certainly not a tech determinist. And I really like this New Yorker cartoon. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I don't think we should be throwing technology at the problem, but rather, what are the challenges where technology could be a terrific solution? And how can we thoughtfully and intentionally apply technology in these cases? But I want to pause. I think we've spoken about the challenges. We've talked about digital as a potential solution. But what are the new risks as we start to introduce these new digital technologies? I think it's quite clear that the evidence base for the safety and effectiveness of these new products simply hasn't kept pace with their development. And, something that's on my mind often is there's huge promise in these technologies to overcome health disparities, to increase access, to develop precision approaches. But there's also risks, right? Are we going to increase precision approaches to care, or are we going to double down on the surveillance economy? Are we going to try and improve health equity, or are we going to make things worse along the digital divide? I think that's the crossroad that, as a field, sort of digital health and digital medicine finds itself at today. So I want to talk about some of the risks, the new risks in the sort of the digital era of health. I'm sure everyone's heard of sort of the Internet of Things, the many, many products that are connected to the Internet ostensibly to make our life easier. How do we now think about the Internet of Bodies? What happens if you get an implantable and the company goes bust? What happens if you have some kind of permanent sort of digital technology for your healthcare and the terms of use change and they want to do different things with your data? There's a terrific article published in the Wall Street Journal that I've got up on the screen here. And it really dives into sort of where we are in terms of sort of courts and laws and regulations, as opposed to the potential new challenges coming down the pike. We've also really got to think about sort of how these technologies are sort of tried and tested and whether they are perhaps unintentionally bringing sort of new risks into the field. This was a Stat News piece around whether wearables, and particularly the sort of the PPG, the sort of the green light that comes out of the back of your smartwatch and measures heart rate, does that work when you have different levels of melanin in the skin? Commercial technologies, I am relieved, perform remarkably well, but there are lots and lots of questions along these lines that we must be mindful of in order to ensure that we don't introduce new biases into the way we sort of care for people, and particularly how we deliver their healthcare. This was a really sort of tremendous study, and it was absolutely accidental. There was a healthcare system that wanted to deploy an algorithm to do better care outreach to sort of hard to reach patients. They didn't even have a race variable in their algorithm, but the power of machine learning is to uncover latent variables. There was a population of folks who were not getting great care to begin with. They were largely absent from the data set. And so when they ran this care outreach program based on the algorithm, they actually realized that they were systematically missing folks from some sort of racial groups. Obviously, they pulled it straight away, but these are the sorts of things we really need to be mindful in this new digital era. We need to think about whether our healthcare systems are prepared for potential sort of cybersecurity threats. We are only as secure as our sort of least vulnerable endpoint. And now with all of these different sort of technologies plugging into a central system for good so that we can actually coordinate data, there are definitely new risks. And I certainly don't think the security research community is well enough represented in our broader healthcare community for the digitization we are facing today. This, and I feel like I'm going through a laundry list, but I wanted to share real examples. This was a terrific op-ed that was published just before the end of last year. And they were able to, the New York Times was given by a whistleblower a huge data set of 12 million phones data, and they could actually track and identify individuals based on where they went to work every day, whether they went to the Women's March, whether they went to the off license after work every day. The visibility into people's lives and the ability to identify them from nothing other than their phone data, which contained their sort of GPS movements, was absolutely extraordinary. And they have some wonderful data visualization. If this piques your interest, it's pretty scary stuff, actually. There's also new ways that potentially we could do a better job at diagnosing patients early. Parkinson's is a condition which has huge benefits when we can get the diagnosis right early on. And oftentimes the vast majority of Parkinson's patients are misdiagnosed. But do you really want to be able, in the absence of privacy protections, be able to infer from how you use your smartphone keyboard whether you may have Parkinson's or not? That's tremendous if we're sending that information to your care provider and we are getting you early treatment. It is absolutely horrendous if we are compiling that information and we are selling it to a third-party broker who may pass it on to a life insurance company, who may pass it on to your to the bank so you can't get a mortgage. In the absence of protections for these sorts of data gathered outside the healthcare setting, we really do face some pretty extraordinary risks. And actually, I want to pause for a second. The Light Collective is a fantastic patient group, and they actually identified sick girl vulnerability in closed Facebook patient groups. So a vulnerability is a bug in a software program that results in the disclosure of personal information. And they identified this vulnerability in patient groups on Facebook. And they actually reported it to Facebook, who came back and said, oh, that's not a vulnerability, that's a feature. And it's just really terrifying that patients are sharing sort of medical information with each other. They find these phenomenal peer support groups. They are absolutely critically important, and their information is not always safe. And this is, I'm going to wrap up my tirade of sort of horror stories now, but this one always makes me smile, and it's from 2010, but it still holds true. If you are not paying for it, you're not the customer, you're the product being sold. And I think as we download all these free apps and these capabilities, we need to be mindful of who is accessing our data, who is combining that data, who's making inferences about our health from that data, and how are we protected, if at all. So lots here. And, I have a flair for the dramatic, but what I want for us to sort of think about, and hopefully we can get into during discussion, is this idea of sort of digital medicine. Are we going to weaponize it, or are we going to make it a powerful tool? And I really do feel that we are at this crossroads, and it's very much up to us as a field, sort of which direction we take. To that end, very quickly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our organization, because this is exactly the work that we focus on day in, day out. We exist to advance the safe, effective, equitable, and ethical use of these technologies. We launched only in May of 2019, and we sit right at the intersection of these two communities who are critical, the healthcare community and the technology community. But those are pretty broad brushstrokes. You can see here we have our regulatory colleagues who sit on our boards, and they sit, right at the table with the executive director of the Biohacking Village from DEF CON. We really do bring together all of these different groups. And actually, while I showed you some logos of some of our leadership, the membership unit here at Dime is the individual, the vector with which we are trying to work to make sure that we pick the right path at this fork in the road, is the individuals working day in, day out to try and advance the use of these tools in the service of better lives. We've got over 1,600 members from around the world. I think it's 43 different countries across 6 continents. And I hope that many of you will consider joining us. We do an awful lot of work. Our mantra is clinical quality work on a tech timeline. And you can see things like since we launched in May, we have, just putting my phone on silent, we've published over 25 different publications. We've made 80-something presentations. We've put in public comments to sort of the federal government. We really are a thriving community. And if this piques your interest, if these questions are interesting to you, if you want to help us make sure we get this right, I hope you will consider joining us. And one thing, and I'm conscious of time, but one thing I did just want to check in with you all was to highlight one resource that might be interesting to you. We do maintain a library of digital endpoints that industry sponsors of new medical products have actually used in their trials to date. You can see that there are 150 unique endpoints that we have in this library, and fascinatingly, just over 30 of them, so nearly 20, or just over 20%, are around sort of diabetes care. So I encourage you to check out that resource. It's a searchable Airtable. You can slice and dice this sort of any way you want, and hopefully this is a tremendous resource for you all. I also, as I said, I hope that many of you will consider joining us. And with that, I will wrap up. Here are my contact informations. You should be able to access the slides as well and all of the links. And I look forward to a tremendous Q&A.